Well, welcome back. In today's session, I thought perhaps I should communicate and share what I think is still an unformed thought process that started over the weekend over a conversation in which I was trying to think of the best way to address the whole concept of whether there is any benefit to a man to get married or to be in a mono relationship, or to move in with, or to live with a woman. And I thought perhaps, although my thoughts are not fully formed, that it would be useful to think aloud and communicate some of what came to mind first, and perhaps we see if we can get to somewhere that we either have a consensus, or we perhaps have to go back to the drawing board and come up with better ways of addressing what I think is a problem. Now let's begin with the problem. Let's define the problem. What I will try to do is identify one of many potential solutions. And in today's session, I will try to see if that solution in today's modern environment is sufficient to meet the needs that the problem creates. Now, you've heard me say before that genuinely in the modern West, when we look at modern men and modern women, there is really no benefit to a man to be married. There is also no benefit for him to be in a committed mono relationship. There is also no benefit for him to be living with a woman. In many ways, every part of our society today almost indicates or recommends to the man that he would have to be almost insane, or really convinced, or very lucky to have met the right person for him to even consider a marriage. Now, in the prior sessions, I have talked about a number of these issues, and so my intention today is not to dwell on some of the ongoing issues, but suffice it to say that one of the interesting ways through which you can identify whether something has a net benefit, and when I talk about the idea that there is no benefit to a man, I'm referring to both the gross benefit and the net benefit. The gross benefit will relate to everything that comes or that accrues to the man before subtracting all of the liabilities. So let's just assume that a relationship is meant to be a source of revenue. That revenue will come with expenses. The expenses, once you deduct those expenses from the revenue, you would have your net benefit, or your net profit, or you might have your what we call your profit margins. In any case, in modern society today, I cannot identify a gross benefit to a man to be married, to be in a mono relationship, or to be living with a woman exclusively under a cohabitation scenario or agreement. Now, I expressed that in one of the prior sessions by explaining that usually the best for a man, the first 6 months of the relationship is normally the best. And I explained before that part of that reason is because dating is really an art of deceit. It's usually a winner takes most approach. It's a zero-sum game, although we choose not to call it that. It's a game in which, in many ways, most people do not want to see truth, honesty, integrity put forward. People want to see you put forward whatever they have created in their imagination of what they believe you should be. And so, because men primarily go on dates for the purpose of sex, we believe that we should do whatever we need to do to obtain sex. Because men generally do not go into dating opportunities with the idea of marriage. Even men who want to be married, we always think first in what I call first principles, which is our primal nature, which is sex. Although we might want something much more from the relationship, usually if the sex is not good enough, most men usually move on to other pastures new. In any case, I explained in the prior sessions that fundamentally at the core, when you look at sex, servitude, and serenity, those are three things that are absent in today's modern women. Initially, at the start of the relationship, the man will get sex on demand because that's usually what is needed to, I guess, to wean the man into the relationship. Now, for most women, and this is something I explained to someone over the weekend, subconsciously, most women from a very, very young age, now irrespective of your social or your philosophical perspective about relationships, most women are raised to recognize that they have something which they can trade for what they want. Back in the day, a woman's beauty and her youth was her dowry. The man paid a price, and that price was in a currency that varied. Sometimes that currency was money. Sometimes that currency was his life. Sometimes that currency was resources. Fundamentally, it came down to two important things: the man's ability to provide and the man's ability to protect the woman. Fundamentally. In exchange, he got and he received access to her beauty, access to reproductive function, and access to her body. It was a fair exchange. Society today has changed. Women do not need men on economic grounds, and I believe rightly so. You know, for many years we only had one half of the population in the West producing and generating all the human capital, and the other half, unfortunately, we're not allowed to bring forth their potential. And so I'm very supportive of the idea that a woman should be an important contributing member of society. We've also created a society in the West where things are relatively peaceful, and therefore the need for physical protection or protection from a tribe, from your tribe, has been made redundant. We have a police who we delegate as a cultural and as a social group. We delegate all of our needs to the police, and everyone is more or less protected. But most important, we've civilized society to the point where we have something in the West called the freedom of speech. So we can discuss issues and disagree and debate, sometimes violently, but because we also have the rule of law. When you combine freedom of speech with the rule of law, and in many ways some of the benefits of the Western civilization, which is the sacredness of life, that means the need for protection from the police is also minimized, because we can disagree, debate, refute each other, and go about our daily lives. So generally, a man has been made redundant from a traditional conservative perspective. In any case, his needs have not been made redundant, and this is perhaps one of the most important parts of today's session. The man's needs have not been made redundant. The man's service in parts of the West have been made redundant. So what you have is a dilemma where women today have a new set of expectations of men, and a new set of gifts to offer. You might call those dowries, that are different to what was provided before. Early days, a woman came to the union being a virgin, having been touched by another man, having her womb intact, never reproduced for another man. And so in many cases, most of the time, men received the highest honor when they laid down what they believed was a fair exchange. Effectively, you got a virgin, you got someone who was still very young, very pure, both physically, mentally, spiritually, not intertwined with other people from the past. In principle, you had a clean slate. The man came as a clean slate, the woman came as a clean slate, and so they could paint a canvas, a life that they wanted together. Unfortunately, they didn't live long enough before life took its inevitable call, and both passed away roughly at age 45 or in mid-40s. You got married at 25, 15 years later, sometimes 20 years later, if you were really lucky, you were dead. It was a short life. It was therefore an intense life. There was a need for collaboration. There was a need for integration. There was a need and a respect that each party had for the other, meaning it was in many ways the importance of David Ricardo's principle of comparative advantage. The woman had a skill set, the man had a skill set. Together, they were better as a unit than individuals. Now, in today's modern society, and I am speaking from a man's perspective, in today's modern society, provision is not necessarily required from a man. For most women, because they can bring home the bacon themselves, and protection is not needed because we live in a relatively civil, safe, respectful society. So therefore the man has nothing to offer, but still has needs. Now this scenario perhaps should have given the man cause to adapt to the woman's needs if the woman stayed in her traditional feminine role and still offered herself, her beauty, her youth, her womb, like she did in the past. That would have caused the man to shift and in principle come to the table with something very different, something unique, and something that was satisfactory from the woman's perspective. On the other hand, what we found is as a result of feminism, womanism, the feminist womanist liberation movement unfortunately dealt a very bad hand to women, especially modern women. To summarize, they were of the perspective that men, and they generalized from the 1960s that men were not behaving with the right level of decorum, the right level of ethical principles. They were behaving very poorly, and they were doing all of that because men had a privilege. And the proposal was, well, if men had a privilege, women also needed to be given that same privilege for other reasons. But like most things, one of the unintended consequences was that when the freedom came, unfortunately, with freedom comes responsibility. But responsibility is a very, very heavy armor to put on. And therefore, most people decided to go for what was the least responsible thing, which is liberation. And that meant that sex became a commodity. Women were then starting to behave just like men in the modern West, which men, interestingly, welcomed, because back in the day, in order for a man to have a wife and have a concubine, he needed to have wealth. When women said, well, whatever a man can do, we can do just as well, and we can be as liberal sexually as the man, and we can be as liberated just as the man, men stood back and said, great, we can have that need for sex met. We can have the need for having multiple partners satisfied without it being a zero-sum game. It was now a fair exchange. The currency of exchange, unfortunately, was not the dowry the man provided, protection and provision. The currency of exchange became whatever the man could do through the art of deception to gain sex. And this is where the zero-sum game began, the art of deceit. Today you would hear women say things such as, when you meet someone, they ask you, the first thing they usually ask is, what do you do? What car do you drive? Where do you live? What do you do for fun? And all of that, although there has been an elimination of the economic need of a man, in women's subconscious mind, there is still that need to rank men into groups and to choose what they believe to be the highest ranked person across a broad range of criteria. That questioning process was something that was done by fathers. The man came to the father with his father, and the father would ask those questions. Fathers were usually much wiser than their children, so men could ask very direct questions, and they could identify and see when a man or a family were being deceitful. Women today, once you turn 18, you're considered in the modern West to be an adult, although you were generally still very, very unwise. You generally lack the judgment, the discernment, the experience, the know-how needed to be able to maneuver the snakes around you. Now, what that meant was, when women asked those questions, men became accustomed to those questions. A man then realized that all he had to do was feign interest, feign affection, present himself in a certain way by having some of the artificial clothing, the artificial things that symbolized that he was doing well, such as a car. Men realize, well, if a woman asks you, what do you do? If you were to say, I'm still a graduate accountant, you're less likely to get sex. But if you said, well, I'm just about to make partner in the top 4 accounting firms, you're more likely to be seen as having the potential or having money. If I showed up in a friend's car, if I hire the car, you're more likely to get sex. You're more likely to get the woman's attention. You're more even likely to get her exclusivity. And that meant that men started to play the game of who can outsmart the other. This is where the zero-sum game and the war, which is why you've heard me say that all is fair in love and war, because dating is like war. Whoever treats the other person the poorest and the most bad usually wins. Remember, it's a zero-sum game. This is not a moral conversation we're having. Now, this simply means that in today's modern society, sex is perhaps the cheapest commodity in the market. Today, I can have sex at a price in pounds sterling that is less than I would pay for a bottle of water if I wanted to. All I have to do is put myself out there. And the reason is because all that decorum and chivalry and courting and pursuits and expectations that were set by society early days have now been pushed to the side. And so men are being asked to behave like complete arseholes, which we thrive in, I should say. And the compensation we receive is the option or the optionality of multiple sex partners. Now, what that means is any man today who is considering marriage, he has to think about marriage in a different light. Most men think about marriage using the traditional lens without reconciling the fact that we are now in the modern world. So we are still thinking about marriage from a traditional perspective without overlaying the new cultural and modern etiquettes of marriage. Before you got married and it was till death, was to do you part. You got married at 25, you lived to 45 at most, 20 years. Today you get married even at 35, which is my minimum age recommendation, and sometimes you live until you're 85, so you have 50 years. But what is interesting is we're getting married at 35 for the man, and most women in the UK, the average age of the woman for marriage in the UK today is 35. So let's just play some gymnastics with expectations and reality. A woman is judged based, from a man's perspective, purely based on her beauty. Purely based on her beauty. In the marketplace of men, a woman is judged purely based on her beauty. That beauty has a derivative. Youth, size, looks, and all the aesthetic features that a woman should have. Skin color, hair length, hair color, thickness of the hair, skin color, I said before, plumpness of the skin, all of that is what a woman is judged based on. Now, I know women hate to hear such a word or a statement. It doesn't change the reality. Men are still hardwired to provide, to protect. We have not given up that role. We will maintain that role because in our nature, subconsciously, that is what makes us men. Our sense of self-worth, self-esteem, self-identity is intrinsically linked to our purpose. Our purpose is linked to what we do. What we do, in many ways, has a derivative form, which is work. We get compensated based on what we do at work. And therefore, intrinsically connected to a man's nature is the ability to provide. And by disposition, because we are simply an extension of the animal kingdom, protection comes naturally to a man, even if we do not know how to physically protect. The instinct to protect is inherent in a man. In any case, if a man judges a woman based on her beauty, and if the average woman in the modern West is getting married at roughly 35, we have an issue. And this is where I bring in today's session together. It's taking me longer than I would have wanted, but this is important. If the average woman is getting married at 35, it means at 35 she has reached, at 35, effectively the lowest point in her beauty. Beginning from 18, a woman has roughly 12 years before beauty and her sexual value starts to decline very rapidly. And by 35, sometimes 40, it's nearly gone. In some cases, there are exceptions. So the woman has 12 years, from 18 to 30. Roughly 12 years. 12 years to make the most important decisions. Early days, she made that decision at 25, which meant between 18 and 23 is 5 years, and then 2 years down from 5 years, effectively is 25. So she was still within the peak of her youth, her beauty. Today, women are getting married at 35. From 30, the beauty starts to decline very rapidly for most women. As a matter of fact, for most women, once you turn 30, it's technically game over, because the quality of men you can attract, the quality of men that you can attract with the most resources, beauty, ability, whatever preferences you have, from 30, that number starts to decline. Because as a man grows older, he has more of his most important responsibilities or resources. Or putting it differently, as a man, as we age, we have more of what women want, especially women who are younger, and that is resources and the ability to provide, whether that be wealth, influence, fame, connections. We have more of that as we age. But as a woman ages, once she gets to 30, she has less of what most men want, which is beauty, youth, and sex. And what this simply means is that in today's modern society, a 35 woman effectively is running at empty in terms of her beauty. Number two, for most men who want to be married and who want to have a family, a woman who's 35 has just arrived at the point where the medical professionals, your obs and gyn, your obstetrician and gynecologist will tell you that high risk pregnancy begins at 35. So beyond 35, at the end of 35, you've just entered high risk pregnancy, which means it's not really safe for the mother or for the baby. So the man who marries a woman at 35, considering that the birth will come a year or more after the marriage, say 36, 37 or beyond, he is actually receiving in what I call reproductive fertility value. He is obtaining almost an empty tank, almost nothing, because the quality of eggs the woman has and the quantity of eggs she has at 35 is almost insignificant. They're still there, but compared to what she had at 20, the difference is huge. So, in the two areas which most men generally want and use as a reason, as a benefit for them to be married, which is, I get beauty, I get youth, and I get sex. And I also want to have a family. He actually does not get, or he does not receive, in exchange for what he brings to the table, he does not receive the most for his money. Now that brings an important question. Does that mean that there is no benefit, therefore, to the man to the modern man to get married? And the answer is yes. Now, there is a benefit to a child born in a two-parent family. There is a benefit to the woman to be married because she gets security with that marriage. But there is no benefit to the man marrying a woman in modern society today, because usually the woman is too old, both in beauty, but also too old, based on her ability to reproduce. Now this brings a question, which what I'd like to do is use an analogy. And cars and women are very, very useful analogies in explaining concepts which most people might become too emotively charged with regards to. If you want to own a car, or if you want to have access to the privilege of what a car offers you in all of its benefits, there are two ways to do this. The first is you can buy the car. The second way is you can lease the car. If you buy the car with all of its responsibilities. You pay up front, then you have to take care of the maintenance, and you have to take care of the inconvenience that comes with an aged car. The newer the car, the easier it is to own and the more enjoyable the car is to own. New sound, new smell, new leather seats, drives great, feels great, sounds great. You also even get, most of the time, free service for a number of months, a number of years. If on the other hand you buy a car that is 35 years old, certainly you will have issues. The suspension is poor, the brakes don't work regularly, you need to go in for a service check, an MOT, and sometimes the pain of owning the car becomes much higher than the benefit of owning the car. So in the UK, every year you have to pay for your taxes, you have to pay for your service checks annually, you have to pay for insurance, you have to pay for petrol, which is going up every day as I speak. You have to pay for all of the other things that are necessary to keep the car in a functioning state. When you consider that most people use their cars in London on average roughly 5% of the time, it makes a lot of people question, why do I own a car? And over the last 4 or 5 years, we had the introduction of what we call ride-hailing services. I can walk down to the end of my street now, and I can confirm, because there are always more than at least 2 cars available. Now, I'm not talking about Uber, and I'm not talking about all the other ride-hailing services. I'm talking about cars or services such as Zipcar, that offer you the opportunity to walk to a car for £10 for an hour. I can hire a car, go turn the car to the same location for £10. Sometimes less than £10, sometimes £6, £7, £8.50. So what I'm being offered are all of the benefits, the advantages that are available to those who own, without all of the responsibility or all of the liabilities of owning the car. Now this makes for a very, very interesting dilemma now, because most people are saying, why own a car if I can still use the car when I want to, get the benefits of using the car when I want to, and not pay the full cost for a car that is about 35 years old. We also then have the likes of Uber, and depending on where you are in the world, Lyft and Didi, that offer the opportunity where they say, listen, you don't even have to drive the car. You don't have to put petrol in the car. We will come to your house and pick you up, drive you to your location, and once you get there, you can exit the car and go about your business. And once you're ready to leave, we will come and pick you up from your location and take you back to your house. So we've in many ways created a scenario whereby it's become a lot easier for people to go about their daily businesses and still achieve and have the needs that they have, which are important, met. Well, if you substitute the car with the woman, I'm sure you already know what the answer to my implied position is. You have two options. You can go about your business and you can get married, and you can marry someone who's 35. You get her at the least attractive point in her life from a sexual marketplace. Of course, the woman still has an intrinsic value, but I'm saying to the marketplace, amongst competing men, you're getting one of the least attractive, and the ability to reproduce for you if you want a family is so minimal and risky, but no problem, it's a free world. You can have whatever you want. You can get married to that. But one thing is guaranteed. Once you get married, everything you believe you need, sex on demand, serenity, servitude, everything you believe you are getting is all an illusion. The moment you get married, she stops trying. You see a sequence of things happen. It's almost as though it's predictable. Now, I have said this to a number of friends, and I've said, just watch the sequence. The moment you consummate the relationship, we're now officially together. We're moving in together. We're getting married. We're now exclusively in a mono relationship. Just like you can set the clock, you can set the timer on the following. The first will be, she puts on weight. The second would be, for some reason and somehow, the long hair she once had will start to get shorter. The third would be, not only does she put on weight, she gets to a point where, in your mind, you're thinking, how did I get into this scenario? The fourth would be, sex starts to decline. You almost have to beg for sex. The fourth will be, she starts to nag because the serenity and the peace you once had disappears. Nothing is ever good enough because suddenly you become a makeover project. She has to make you over in her image. The fourth will be, I may have cooked for you when we were dating, just to get the ring, just to get you to say yes, just to move in with you. But now we are in this relationship, we are now equal, which I agree. You cook for yourself. You have a right hand, you have a left hand. Go into the kitchen and do it yourself. So all of the things that most men traditionally think that they are going to get is all an illusion. But guess what? You get to choose. That is option A. And what is option B? Now, when I lived during my 20s, I worked very long hours. And I, back then, applied the whole concept of outsourcing. This is something businesses use. You can have fixed costs, or you can transition to variable costs through the process of outsourcing your needs to other people outside the organization who could do the same service for you without all of the overheads. So back then, some days I worked 14, 15, 16 hours, came home, slept, woke up the next day, back to work, waking up just before 5, sometimes getting home just before 10. So I had no life outside of work, but I still had needs. Cooking, cleaning, ironing was outsourced. I had someone come over, and for £20, I could have them come over, do the cooking. It's a 2-hour window, do the kids. I was very specific about what I wanted. And if I needed extra time, fine. It only cost me an extra £10. Initially, when it started, it was £7.50. £6.50, you could find good people. And they would do the cleaning. Remember, I spent almost no time at home. So this wasn't a very dirty house. Now, I had modern 24 work shirts. So I wore one every single day. Interestingly, I never repeated the same in the same month. But that meant that at the end of the month, I could do a bulk wash and ironing and laundry, and the person could do everything in one batch. Or they could do it weekly. I was very flexible. But that meant the person would come in, everything goes into the washing machine, they start the cleaning. Once they were done, they could help me in the kitchen. I had my meals prepared, packed, put it in the freezer. I was ready for the week. My clothes were ironed. My house was clean. So you could see that the traditional roles that a woman, a wife, would have provided to me, the value that she would have brought to my life was covered by an outsider, someone who was willing to take a payment every week or every 2 weeks to fulfill that need. Now this eliminated the servanthood role that a woman would have provided in my life. I didn't need a woman for any of that. This also meant that I, therefore, could be out. I could work longer hours at work if I had to. If there was a deadline, I could stay till 1, 2 a.m. in the office, come back home, not have to report to anyone, which meant when I walked through the front door, there was peace. My house was serene. There was almost silence across the whole place. Why? Because there was no one there, either to nag, to question, that I had to report back to, or there was no one to feel disappointed that I chose work over her, the woman. And this brings me to the third and the final point, which is sex. This meant that about 95% of my time was spent with work. I only had 5% of my time for women. And therefore, I was not in the mindset to be in a relationship. I made it very clear that I was emotionally unavailable. I didn't have time. I didn't want to make promises I could not keep. I didn't want to have to explain myself. I just didn't want the burden. I had made up my mind that until I got to 35, I was not going to get married. Not even possible. And that made my life easy because it meant I didn't have to lie. I didn't have to cheat. I didn't have to sneak around town. I could have been out. I was always very direct with people. I said, listen, I don't have time. If you want to have a good time, great, let's make it happen. Now, recognizing that women had declined and reduced the cost of sex almost to nothing. In many ways, most women were happy to throw themselves at you if they believed that your career was a successful one, that you lived in a great location, you owned or you rented a great home, there was prospect that there would be wealth. Just the idea of that alone encouraged most women to offer sex even before you asked for sex. And in exchange, they wanted nothing in return. They were actually asking to come and provide the same functions that the hired people were providing for me. But the whole idea and expectation was that at some point in the future, they would get all those benefits, which is security. Now, the second model that I've just explained is what I think most young men should start considering in their minds. You don't have to buy the cow if you can still get the milk. You can go to the shops and buy a pint. It's cheaper. You don't have to feed the cow. You don't have to protect the cow. You don't have to wake up at 3 a.m. in the morning to make sure the cow is safe, to make sure it's not infected. You can simply have the milk delivered to your doorstep. And this means that for most young men today, remaining single or remaining unmarried could be one of the most important choices you make between age 18 and age 35. Now, from age 35 and above, most young men would have come into their manhood. You've exposed yourself to the various ideas, possibilities, that are out there, you've actually given yourself the opportunity to fulfill and achieve your dreams and goals. In my opinion, the most important thing that must be satisfied before marriage. Now, if you achieve that before 35, then that's fantastic. At that point, the idea of marriage should be something you should entertain, but not without, in my opinion, carrying out a cost-benefit analysis. When I say there are no benefits to a man being married, the reason I say that is because today, companionship, sex, fatherhood, in terms of someone reproducing a life on your behalf, bringing your seed to the world, some of the traditional benefits are now available to the man outside of marriage, which means the marriage today is simply a contract with the state, but with very, very specific penalties to the man, especially if he does not incorporate the important legal conditions which come in the form of a prenuptial agreement or a cohabitation agreement to protect his wealth. Now, this simply means that you can get all of the traditional benefits that accrued to old men or men of older generations. You can still get all of that because all of that is now available to the modern man. It's a gift. It's almost like a gift that keeps on giving. The modern woman is saying, take. And therefore, in a zero-sum game, or in a game of war, it's the winner takes most. You should be thinking about how can I get the most of my needs met, but give the least of my resources and of my time. A very, very sad and cynical way to look at relationships. But recognize that if I was speaking to women, I would be saying the same thing to them. Between 18 and 35 for the man has to focus on himself, his dreams, his goals, his passion, becoming his best self, and along the way, get what you can by any means necessary. When you turn 35, if you choose to, sit down, don't think with your heart, don't even think with your head alone, because sometimes matters of the head sometimes are conflated with matters of the heart. Think logically. Think with a piece of paper and a pen, like you would in a pro forma financial statement. Income statements, balance sheets, and statement of equity. Your income statement should be what's coming in, what are the costs, what is my net profit. Balance sheet should be what are my assets, what are my liabilities. Now, I would round up today's session by saying, in Great Britain today, specifically in England, 7 out of 10 divorces are filed by women. The average age of the marriage is 7 years. When the marriage takes place, let me rephrase, forgive me. In Great Britain, and specifically in England, 7 out of 10 divorces are filed by women. The average length of marriage for people who have been married since, give it roughly 20 years, or 22 years, since year 2000, because I'm relating to new rather than old marriages, people who married, who were Generation X and baby boomers and the millennials. The sense were very different to the millennials and the Gen Zs and the Gen Ys and the younger generation. Very different in temperament, in understanding, in discernment, in wisdom. But if you congregate and you simply say, in the last 20 to 30 years, what has been the average length of marriage? 7 years. So 7 out of 10 divorces filed by women, and at the most you get 7 years. Usually, at least half, 1 in every 2 marriages will end in divorce. 1 in 2 will end in divorce. And when you accumulate that and you say, okay, I get that, When I get a divorce, in most cases, half of the man's wealth and more is lost. Effectively, it's a payment to the woman, whether that be alimony or whatever structure that comes under. So he loses half his wealth. In addition, if he wants to have kids, and if he had kids, 9 out of 10 times, the mother gets the custody of the child, because the courts in London and the courts in the UK have a hatred towards men. And therefore, 9 out of 10 times, the child is used against the father. What that simply means is when you add up all of that, let's just imagine that to be a balance sheet. Everything I've described so far are liabilities. If I were to ask most married men to identify the assets they have, most of them cannot even list their wives or list the benefits the wives bring to them, whether that be meeting his needs, meeting his need goals or his seed goals. Most men will tell you that their modern wives are more thorns in their flesh than gifts to them. When you summarize the income statement, the balance sheets, and the statement of equity, it's not really hard to come to the conclusion that there are no benefits. Now, I can keep going on. Back in the day, it was possible for the man to say, well, at least my wife would have my last name, and we'll be one family. Today, most women want to have double-barrel names, or they want to have their own father's names. So not only are you marrying someone, paying that price, she wants to remain under the authority by name of her father. So in principle, the benefits are really few and far between. And so what I like to leave with you guys as a closing statement is this. It's okay to think about marriage in the traditional way, but keep two things in mind. Number one, longevity of life. We're living longer than we ever did. So if you get married to someone who's 35, there's a good chance if both of you live, you will live together for 50 years, if you live together. But more likely than not, that will end in less than 7 years. The price you would pay for making such a stupid mistake of signing a piece of paper, which is a contract with the state, will be too dear, too high compared to the benefits you would get during the early stages of the marriage. Number two, you have been given the opportunity in modern society today to lease and to outsource all of your needs. And that means sex, the need for servitude, and any need you want, that any need a woman would have provided previously, you can and you should think about outsourcing those needs. Now, there is one area where I start to take a different position, which is if you want to have children, and if you're responsible enough to recognize the sacrifice that is needed and that you must make, then it is certainly plausible that you can overlook all of your needs, because that's what you will do, and put the needs of the child to be born, because the child is not born yet, the child to be born, to put their needs above your needs. In which case, we know from statistics, we know from society, we know from the social, cultural data sets that we've been producing over the last 70 years, we know that there are benefits to a child being raised in a two-parent family, a loving, devoted, caring parents. There is a benefit, in which case it's plausible that you can say, for the sake of my child, I would take that gamble. But if you do not want to have children, if you have no intentions of having children, I would encourage you to apply the concept of hesitation to stop, play the numbers, put it into numerical terms. Numbers never lie, and that's the reason why we call numbers characters. Letters and numbers are called characters because they have integrity. They do not change, which means if you take those benefits and costs and itemize them in numerical fashion, you will find that each of the benefits you identify and the cost you identify, when you add both, you get a net value. There will be integrity in the results you get. If the results come up and there's a net benefit, then the choice is yours to make. Similarly, if the results come up and there is a net negative, again, the result is yours to make. We all individually, we get to choose our own poisons. Whether you take the benefits that you believe will be positive, or whether you avoid what you believe will be a cost or a negative, you are taking your poison. Whatever poison you drink, one thing you should always do is take it as a man. We know Socrates, when he took the poison, you don't complain, you don't explain, you take the poison. That's the choice you've made. Now, I hope that's been useful. I think that's where I'll stop for today. And I wish you all the best.